Next up is Dr. Sampat from Columbia University.
Great. So thank you, Amitabh, and for the organizers for inviting me. I've learned a lot already. I was asked to discuss a paper that I published in 2011 in Health Affairs with Frank Lichtenberg. I'm also going to try to do my best to kind of bring it back to the here and now a little bit and update it a little bit. But the basic idea is, before I go to that slide, people have been fighting about this topic, the respective roles of the public and private sectors in pharmaceutical innovation and implications for things like prices and access and competition. For 70 odd years, basically since the government started funding research seriously near the end of World War II. One of the things Professor Lichtenberg and I kind of noticed in surveying these debates is that oftentimes the various sides were talking past one another and kind of conflating different types of roles that the public sector has in pharmaceutical innovation. And we thought it would be useful conceptually to distinguish between those, and then as best as we could to try to measure these sort of different channels. Suffice it to say, without going into too much detail, we can think about a direct effect of the public sector, where a public sector a research institute like the NIH or an NIH grantee basically kind of discovers the compound or takes to continue the football analogy, takes the ball down the field enough to have a patent that's associated with the final product and listed on the FDA's Orange Book. And these are patents that you can think of as emerging from the Bayh-Dole Act or Stevenson-Weidler Act for intramural research. So that's the kind of direct effect where the federal government is doing research or funding research that's kind of developing a technology that's patented and then listed among the patents that are key to the final drug product. There's also a more indirect kind of enabling role where you can think about different kinds of indirect effects here. So the key insight comes from the public sector, research tools, techniques, things like that as well. And what I'm going to try to show you very quickly is just some ways in which we've thought about measuring these two effects, necessarily imperfect, and what the data say. We're missing other types of roles that maybe we could talk about later on in the Q&A, including other potential public sector roles that are not captured by these analyses that are starting from patents and working backwards. Before I show you the framework and the results, why do we care? What are the stakes? I think that these different types of roles matter differently in different kinds of policy debates going back the last 50, 60 years and even today. One question we might want to ask is, what is the rate of return to NIH research? What are we getting out of the $30, $40 billion we spend on the NIH each year? And for that, I think both the direct and the indirect effects are relevant. We want to think about stuff directly coming out of the labs, but also stuff that's enabled by NIH funding. A second argument, and this is kind of in the news today, is the idea that we don't need high drug prices, we don't need patents and things like that, because the public sector does all of the important stuff, and you'll hear that today. I think for that argument, you'd want to know both the direct and indirect contributions, but that argument is stronger, I think, to the extent that the direct contribution is greater. And then finally, we hear discussion, and it was alluded to in the previous presentation, about trying to harness the public sector role, the Bayh-Dole rights or Stevenson-Weidler rights, to affect downstream prices, access, and things like that. And there, I think only the direct effect under current law, as I understand it, only really the direct effect or the ownership of patents is relevant. Okay, with that long setup, let me show you a few quick pictures and then some numbers. I should have oriented this differently, but that's okay. So this is what we mean by the direct effect. This is a case where an NIH grant leads to a patent. This is actually a patent to my university, Columbia University. That patent is referenced, is listed on the FDA's Orange Book as associated with what became a glaucoma treatment, a blockbuster glaucoma treatment, Xalatan. So in this case, one of the patents on Xalatan directly came out of an NIH grant, right? And that's what we're talking about as the direct effect, and we're tracing it through these government interest statements and sections of patents, but we'll do some robustness using other measures as well. There's also an indirect or enabling effect, and that's harder to measure. The way in which we did so there is to work through publications. So we're going to look at an NIH grant, we're going to look at the publications it generates, and then we're going to look at the extent to which later patents cite back to that publication as prior art, and whether those patents are associated with marketed drugs. So that's the kind of indirect effect. It's working through publications coming out of NIH research, not patents directly coming out of NIH research. Okay. So here are the data used in the previous paper. Essentially all new molecular entities approved between 1988 and 2005, as well as some other information that I need not go through here. Here's the first set of results that I'm going to show you. So for the 379 drugs in this sample that had at least one patent, if you look at the rightmost column, about 9% of them had a public sector patent. Okay. So that's what we're calling the direct effect. The indirect effect is much larger. About half of them cited a public sector patent and/or publication. You might want to ask, what about more important drugs? That's a hard thing to measure. One way in which we imperfectly do so empirically is to look at priority review drugs versus other types of drugs. There, it looks like in the penultimate column, about 17% of priority review drugs you see this direct effect, and about 2/3 of them you see this sort of indirect effect. Okay. I also promised Amitabh I would not just go through the numbers, but talk a little about where the bodies are buried here, just so we can think about some of the problems here. One is, in terms of measuring the direct effect, government interest statements are notoriously incomplete, especially so up until the 2000s or so. R.T. Rai and I have done some kind of digging on this. Universities and other grantees weren't always compliant. There's continued concern today that some of these things are buried in certificates of correction and things like that. I actually don't think that's going to affect the overall shares all that much, but one thing we can do, and we've probed this and we can talk about that, but one thing we can do as a kind of crude robustness is not to look at government interest statements, but just to look at all academic or public sector assignees to measure the direct effect. And there, the total direct effect increases from 9% to 13%, again, about 1 in 5 priority review drugs. There are also limitations for the indirect effect, probably more so, in fact. Limitations for using patent to publication citations to measure these indirect impacts of publicly funded research. And I think here there can be both kind of false positives and false negatives, to be very honest. As the lawyers in the room will tell you, patent citations are, do not try this at home, right? They're not meant to be used by economists. They have very specific legal purposes, and we're kind of interpreting them as measures of intellectual influence or knowledge flows. There are open questions that economists and others are working on today, including what these citations actually represent, the cruciality of each citation to the final product. So to go back to Dr. Austin's presentation at the beginning, the complicated one, right? Not the pipeline model. Just because we see one public sector publication associated with a drug kind of in the top left corner of your diagram, do we want to count that as a public sector patent? Is it necessary? Was it sufficient? There's all that other stuff too. How to mix and stir these things is conceptually difficult and also empirically difficult. So that's that's just a concern in an area of ongoing research. Another concern might be this, that the analysis is quite dated, and for various reasons it didn't include biologic drugs because they weren't subject to FDA Orange Book listings. This is a preliminary update and you should take it as such, but I just want to show you not much changes with the overall story if we first update the numbers to drugs approved between 1995 and 2017. Let's focus on the priority review drugs. Again, about 1 in 5 you see this direct effect, and here about 80% you see this indirect effect, this citing back. For interest of time, I'll skip the second set of results, though they draw on Dr. Woodcock's data. Suffice it to say that both the direct and indirect effects are more pronounced for first-in-class drugs. But we can also look at a very small sample, but maybe an important one, the top 20 drugs by sales in 2018, about half of which are biologics, I think actually slightly more than half of which are biologic drugs. There you see a direct effect in about a third, and an indirect effect in almost all of these drugs. So the numbers go up a little bit, but the orders of magnitudes and the relative contributions seem about the same. So to sort of sum this up, and I should say I've talked about my own research because that's what I was asked to do here, but there are other people, including other people in this room, so Aaron Kesselheim, Ashley Stevens, and others who have done similar types of analyses. And my read on the literature is that the results, at least on the direct effect, are quite robust across the literature. That something like 10% of all drugs and maybe 20 to 30% of important drugs using various measures of importance, you can directly link back to public sector research. The vast majority of drugs link back bibliometrically through this indirect effect to publicly funded research. We've also seen this in other ways. So there was a PNAS article published by Cleary et al. That looked at just publications for drugs. Similar thing, like almost all, if not all, there is some NIH publication on the drug. And how you want to count that, that's all subject to the limitations we talked about before. So let me then conclude, with just a little bit, and I realize this will be part of the discussion for the day, but just thinking about what all this means. I think the indirect effect is, in some sense, well, we see consistently that NIH publications are linked bibliometrically to nearly all important drugs. I think there's actually a research question we need to answer here, which is to try to understand how pivotal or crucial the NIH publication was, and there are broader research questions about the intellectual contributions that these types of citation flows capture and miss. I think we can say more at this point about the direct role. 20 to 30% of important drugs. Is that large or small? So there's this old joke that if you ask an economist, how's your spouse, the answer is compared to what? And here the comparison is to your priors. So if your prior was the government does it all, then 30% seems like a small direct role. If your prior was that all the important stuff is coming out of the private sector pharmaceutical firms, this seems like a significant number. We could talk about that. Let's leave to the lawyers later on a discussion about whether for this 20 to 30% of drugs, we're probably talking about, if we count biologics, 250, 300 drugs on the market right now, whether it's feasible under current law or under laws we might think about to leverage that access to affect prices and access. A different question is whether that would be desirable to do, and I think there, going back to some of the discussion earlier, we want to think a little bit about what that would do to incentives to commercialize, to kind of take the ball and run with it in the first place, and that's an open empirical question, I think, as well. And then finally, and this has been alluded to a little bit as well today, we might think that direct role is too small. We might think that a direct role implies the ability to do something about prices and access, through government rights, and we might think it's too small. We might want the government to be doing more downstream, including not only the things that we've talked about in the previous two presentations, but actual, maybe funding of clinical trials or something like that. And I think that too is a very lively policy debate. So I think that's all I have for now, with 2 minutes to spare. So I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you.